The screaming lasted 43 seconds. That's not a guess. That's not an approximation. That is the exact duration confirmed by the timestamp on a voice memo that 61-year-old Ruth Pickett recorded on her iPhone from her bedroom window at 20:17 a.m. on a Thursday morning in March. 43 seconds of a woman's voice, high, raw, the kind of sound that doesn't come from movies or television or anything manufactured, the kind that comes from somewhere so deep in the human body that it bypasses everything between the gut and the throat and just tears out into the open air without permission. 43 seconds, then nothing. Ruth lived at 4012 Sycamore Court in Knoxville, Tennessee, a quiet residential cul-de-sac in the Holston Hills neighborhood on the eastern edge of the city, where the houses were older and well kept and sat on generous lots with mature oak trees that made the whole street feel slightly removed from the rest of the world. It was the kind of neighborhood where people had lived for decades, where you knew which dog belonged to which yard, where the mail carrier knew everyone's name. The kind of place where a sound like that, at 2 in the morning, landed with the force of something dropped from a great height. The sound came from 414 Sycamore Court, next door. Ruth called 911 at 20:19 a.m., 2 minutes after the screaming stopped, because the first minute she spent standing at her window with her heart in her throat, trying to convince herself she'd misheard something, and the second minute she spent picking up her phone with hands that had already made the decision her brain was still catching up to. The dispatcher asked her to describe what she'd heard. Ruth said it was a woman screaming. The dispatcher asked if she could still hear anything. Ruth said no. The dispatcher asked if she saw any activity at the neighboring property. Ruth pressed her face closer to the glass and looked. The house at 414 Sycamore Court was dark. Every window, no movement, no lights coming on the way they do when something happens inside a house and people react to it. Just dark, the way it had been when Ruth went to bed at 11, the same quiet dark it always was. She told the dispatcher it looked like nothing was happening. The dispatcher sent a unit anyway. 2 Knoxville PD officers arrived at 20:31 a.m. They knocked. They waited. They knocked again, louder, announcing themselves. A light came on in the front room, visible through the narrow gap in the curtains, and approximately 90 seconds later the front door opened. The man who answered was 44 years old, medium height, dark hair showing early gray at the temples, wearing a gray t-shirt and sweatpants with the particular rumpled quality of someone pulled recently from sleep. His name was Todd Garner. He had lived at 414 Sycamore Court for 6 years. He was a project manager for a civil engineering firm downtown. He drove a sensible gray SUV and kept his gutters clean and waved to neighbors when he got the mail. He had, as far as anyone on Sycamore Court could recall, never given anyone a single reason to think twice about him. He looked at the officers with the expression of a man who was confused and cooperative and slightly annoyed in the way that anyone pulled from sleep at 2:30 in the morning had a right to be. The officers explained the reason for the visit. A neighbor had reported hearing screaming from the property. Todd Garner blinked, ran a hand through his hair, said he'd been asleep since around midnight, that his wife was also asleep, that he hadn't heard anything unusual. He said it with the calm, slightly apologetic tone of a man who genuinely believed a mistake had been made and wanted to help resolve it without making things difficult for anyone. One of the officers asked if they could speak with his wife. Todd Garner's expression didn't change. Not dramatically. Not in a way you could point to later and say, that was the moment. It was more like a very brief stillness. A half-second pause that could mean anything or nothing, and that the officer, a 7-year veteran named Marcus Webb, no relation to anyone in any other story, filed away in the back of his mind the way experienced officers file things that don't fit cleanly into any category. Then Todd Garner stepped back from the door and said, of course, give him just a moment, and disappeared into the interior of the house. He returned 90 seconds later with a woman beside him. She was 41 years old, dark-haired slight, wearing a robe. Her name, she said, was Carol Garner. She said she was fine. She said she hadn't screamed. She said she didn't know what the neighbor could have heard. She said all of it in a voice that was steady and reasonable and cooperative. She said all of it without once making eye contact with either officer. Marcus Webb had been on the Knoxville PD for 7 years, and in that time he had stood in a lot of doorways and looked at a lot of faces and developed the particular kind of instinct that doesn't come from training manuals or classroom instruction, but from standing in enough faces until the nervous system starts doing the analysis faster than your conscious mind can articulate it. Carol Garner's face was doing something he couldn't name precisely. It wasn't fear exactly. It wasn't the flat effect of someone medicated or dissociated. It was more like the expression of a person who was performing composure so carefully and so deliberately that the performance itself had become visible, the way a painting looks different up close when you can see the brushstrokes underneath. He noted it. He didn't act on it. Not yet. He had no legal basis to act on it. A neighbor had reported screaming. The residents of the home were present, apparently unharmed, and denying that anything had occurred. Without visible injury, without an explicit request for help, without any evidence of a crime in plain sight, his options were limited in the way that the law sometimes limits options in the spaces between what feels wrong and what can be proven. He gave Carol Garner his card, told her to call if she needed anything, watched her take the card with both hands and hold it the way you hold something you intend to keep. Watched Todd Garner put his hand on the small of her back as the door closed, a gesture that could be read as affectionate or proprietary, depending on what you already believed about the person doing it. Marcus sat in the patrol car outside for 4 minutes before his partner told him they needed to move on. He wrote the call up as a noise complaint. Investigated. No evidence of disturbance. Residents present and cooperative. Standard language for a situation that produced nothing actionable. He filed it and moved on, because that was the job and the job required you to move on. He thought about Carol Garner's eyes for 3 days afterward. Ruth Pickett did not move on. Ruth was a retired middle school science teacher who had lived at 412 Sycamore Court for 22 years, raised 2 kids in that house, buried her husband in 2019, and settled into a widowhood that was quieter than she'd expected and lonelier than she let on to her children, who lived in Atlanta and Nashville respectively and called on Sundays with the regularity of people managing guilt from a distance. She was sharp and observant and had the particular stubbornness of a woman who had spent 3 decades managing classrooms full of 12-year-olds and had long since stopped being talked out of things she knew to be true. She knew what she had heard. She had the recording to prove it. She also knew Carol Garner. Not well, they weren't close friends, weren't the kind of neighbors who shared meals or exchanged keys. But they had spoken over the fence dozens of times across the 6 years the Garners had lived next door. Ruth had watched Carol the way observant neighbors watch people, passively, consistently, accumulating detail without intending to. She knew Carol gardened in the early mornings before Todd left for work. She knew Carol had stopped gardening sometime around the previous fall. She knew Carol used to walk a rescue greyhound named Pepper, and that Pepper had disappeared from the yard one day, about 8 months ago, and Carol had told Ruth, when asked, that Pepper had gotten out through a gap in the fence, voice perfectly steady, eyes somewhere else entirely. She knew that Carol Garner had not had a visible friend visit the house in over a year. The morning after the screaming, Ruth knocked on the door at 414 Sycamore Court at 9 a.m. She brought a plate of lemon bars, because bringing food was the grammar of her generation, and because it gave her a reason to be there that required no explanation. Todd Garner's gray SUV was gone. He left for work between 7:30 and 8 every morning with the reliability of a commuter train. Carol answered the door in the same robe from the night before. She looked like she hadn't slept. Her hair was unwashed, and her eyes had the swollen quality of recent, crying, though her face was composed in that same careful way Ruth had seen through her living room window when the police were there. Ruth held out the plate and smiled. "Just wanted to check on you, honey." Something moved across Carol Garner's face. Quick, like a shadow crossing ground when a cloud passes overhead. Then it was gone and the composure was back. "I'm fine, Ruth." "Thank you." Ruth looked at her, looked carefully, the way she used to look at students who said they were fine in the exact tone that meant they weren't. "Carol." She kept her voice low, even. "I have the recording." The color left Carol Garner's face so completely and so fast that Ruth reached out instinctively and put a hand on her arm. "I'm not trying to make trouble," Ruth said quietly. "I'm trying to help. But I need to know you're okay." Carol looked over her shoulder, the instinct of someone checking a space behind them that they have learned to check. Then she looked back at Ruth. Her lips parted, closed, parted again. "You should go," she whispered. "Please. Ruth, you should go right now." She stepped back and closed the door with a soft click that was somehow more frightening than a slam would have been. Ruth stood on the porch for a moment, holding her plate of lemon bars and feeling the particular chill of a warm March morning that had just turned cold. She went home. She sat at her kitchen table. She thought for a long time. Then she called the Knoxville Police Department non-emergency line and asked to speak to whoever had responded to her call the previous night. She asked to speak to Officer Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb took the call at his desk at 11:14 that morning and listened to Ruth Pickett without interrupting, which was something he was genuinely good at, and which Ruth appreciated enough to mention later when she described the conversation to her daughter in Atlanta. Ruth told him about the lemon bars, about Carol's face when Ruth mentioned the recording, about the way Carol had looked over her shoulder before she spoke, about Pepper the greyhound disappearing 8 months ago, about the gardening that stopped, about the friends who no longer visited, about 22 years of passive, consistent neighbor observation that had assembled itself overnight into something she could no longer interpret as anything other than a pattern. Marcus listened to all of it. Then he asked her to send him the voice memo. She emailed it to the address he gave her, and he played it twice at his desk with his door closed. 43 seconds. The sound quality was imperfect, recorded through a closed window from next door at 2 in the morning, but it was unambiguous. That was a woman's voice. That was a woman in real distress. Whatever Carol Garner and Todd Garner had told the responding officers at 2:30 in the morning, that recording existed before their denial and didn't care about it. He took it to his supervising sergeant, a methodical 15-year veteran named Diane, who listened to it once, asked 2 questions, and told Marcus to write up a formal follow-up report and flag it for the domestic violence unit. The DV unit assigned a detective named Paul Reyes that same afternoon, 38 years old, compact and quiet, the kind of investigator who gathered information the way water gathers in low places, without apparent effort, by simply being present in the right positions. Paul Reyes knocked on the door at 4014 Sycamore Court at 2 p.m. Todd Garner's SUV was still gone. Carol answered in different clothes this time, jeans, a long-sleeved shirt despite the mild afternoon, and the composure was back in place, restored and reinforced. But Paul Reyes had spent 6 years in domestic violence investigations, and composure was not the same thing as safety, and he knew the difference the way a doctor knows the difference between a patient who is well and a patient who has learned to present as well. He did not push. He did not challenge. He asked Carol if he could come in for a few minutes, just to follow up on the previous night's call. Standard procedure, nothing to worry about. She let him in because refusing entry to a police detective conducting a follow-up visit carried its own complications, and she was clearly a woman who had learned to calculate complications carefully. The living room was neat, aggressively neat, the kind of clean that goes beyond tidiness into something that feels managed. Paul noted the absence of personal photographs on the walls, hooks visible where frames had hung, small pale rectangles on the paint where they'd blocked the light for years before being taken down. He noted the way Carol sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and her eyes tracking the room's entry points with the automatic vigilance of someone for whom vigilance had become involuntary. He asked her about the previous night. She repeated the same account, asleep, heard nothing, didn't know what the neighbor could have reported. Voice steady, hands still. Paul asked her gently how she was doing generally. She said fine. He asked how long she and Todd had been married. 14 years, she said. He asked if she was working currently. She said no. She'd left her job at an insurance company the previous spring to focus on some things at home. She said it with a naturalness that had the slight hollowness of a sentence rehearsed enough times to sound unrehearsed. Paul asked if she had family nearby. Something shifted, micro movement around the eyes. Gone in under a second. My sister is in Memphis, Carol said. We talk sometimes. Paul noted the sometimes. He noted the Memphis. He wrote up everything after he left and added it to the file and flagged two things specifically: the removed photographs and the long-sleeved shirt on a 62-degree afternoon. The investigation that followed over the next 8 days was quiet and careful and lateral. The kind of work that happens around the edges of a situation when the situation itself won't open directly. Paul pulled public records on Todd Garner. Clean. No criminal history, no restraining orders, no civil judgments. Employment verified, reputation at the firm unremarkable. No red flags in any database that existed to contain red flags. He contacted Carol's sister in Memphis. Her name was Diane Mercer, 53 years old, retired nurse. She answered Paul's call on the second ring, and the first thing she said, before Paul had finished explaining who he was, "I've been waiting for someone to call about Carol for 8 months." She talked for 40 minutes. She told Paul that Carol had stopped returning her calls in the previous July. That the last time they'd spoken, Carol had seemed distracted and careful in a way that Diane described as like talking to someone who was choosing every single word. That she had driven to Knoxville unannounced in September to check on her sister, and Todd had answered the door and been perfectly pleasant and explained that Carol was resting and not feeling well, and had texted Diane from Carol's phone 20 minutes later saying she was fine and would call soon. She had not called. Diane had filed a welfare check request with Knoxville PD in October. An officer had visited, spoken to Carol at the door, noted she appeared to be in good health and was not requesting assistance, and closed the check. Paul pulled that welfare check report. Read it twice, cross, referenced the responding officer's notes with what he now knew, and felt the specific discomfort of seeing how a situation can be looked at directly and still not seen. Then he ran a deeper search on Todd Garner. Not just Tennessee records, national, and he widened the parameters to include prior addresses. Todd Garner had lived in Spokane, Washington between 2009 and 2014. Paul contacted the Spokane PD cold case unit as a routine inquiry. The response came back in less than 3 hours, faster than routine inquiries typically move, which told Paul something before he even read the content. There had been a missing persons case in Spokane 2013. A woman named Angela Forsythe, 36 years old at the time of her disappearance. Last known address, 4 doors down from Todd Garner's Spokane residence. Case status open. No body ever recovered. Paul sat at his desk and read the Spokane file summary for a long time in the particular silence of a room where something just got much larger than it was before. Then he picked up the phone and called the Spokane detective whose name was on the case file. "Tell me about Angela Forsythe," he said. The Spokane detective's name was Rosa Medina. She had worked the Angela Forsythe case from the beginning in 2013 and had never fully let it go the way detectives sometimes can't let go of the ones that don't resolve, the ones that sit in the back of a filing cabinet and the back of a mind simultaneously, accumulating dust in one place and weight in the other. She was retired now, had been for 2 years, but when Paul Reyes called the Spokane PD cold case unit and left his number, it was Rosa Medina who called him back 40 minutes later from her personal cell, because the cold case unit had her flagged as the original investigator, and because she had picked up that phone so fast it suggested she had been waiting for a ringing for a long time. She talked for 90 minutes. Paul recorded it with her permission and took 11 pages of handwritten notes, and when it was over he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment the way you do when the shape of something has just become clear, and the clarity is worse than the confusion was. Angela Forsythe had been 36 years old in the spring of 2013. Graphic designer, freelance, worked from home. She had lived alone on Garland Avenue in the Shadow Park neighborhood of Spokane. She was described by everyone who knew her as warm, social, independent, the kind of person with a full life and a wide circle, and no obvious reason to disappear voluntarily. She had vanished on a Wednesday evening in April. Her apartment was found in the same condition that Brianna Marsh's Durham apartment would be found 9 years later in a different state. Lights on, food out, personal belongings present, phone left behind. The kind of absence that announces itself as wrong before anyone has processed why. Todd Garner had been 30. No relation to the Garner of 14 years later's marriage. No, wait. Paul stopped. Read. Todd Garner had been 31 years old in 2013 and living 4 houses down from Angela Forsythe on Garland Avenue. He had been interviewed as a neighbor witness. He had been cooperative, articulate, and helpful in the way that made Rosa Medina note in her file that he was almost too composed for someone whose neighbor had just vanished. But composure wasn't a crime and helpfulness wasn't a red flag. And without anything more concrete, he had remained exactly what he appeared to be on paper, which was a witness and nothing more. Rosa had looked at him harder. She had found nothing she could use. What she had found, and what she told Paul about, in the particular measured tone of someone who had been carrying information for a decade, without anywhere useful to put it, was a woman named Sandra Tully, 44 years old at the time. She had lived 2 streets over from Garland Avenue. She had come to Rosa voluntarily, about 3 weeks after Angela's disappearance, with a story that Rosa had documented carefully and been unable to act on for reasons that came down, ultimately, to the same wall that domestic violence investigations always eventually hit. Sandra Tully had been in a relationship with Todd Garner for approximately 8 months in 2012 and early 2013. It had ended. She used that word with careful neutrality. Ended, the way people use neutral words for things that were not neutral. In February of 2013, 2 months before Angela Forsythe disappeared, Sandra told Rosa that during those 8 months, Todd had been, in her words, the most normal, seeming person she had ever met for the first 4 months, and the most frightening person she had ever been close to for the last 4. She described a pattern. Incremental isolation, removed from friends first, then family, gradually, through mechanisms so subtle she hadn't recognized them as mechanisms, until she was already isolated. Monitoring of her phone and her movements presented as concern and attentiveness. Reactions to small infractions that were disproportionate in ways that left no marks because they were calibrated not to. And then one night, she was precise about this. The way trauma makes people precise about certain moments. One night she had made a sound she did not intend to make, and a neighbor had knocked on the door 20 minutes later to check if everything was okay, and Todd had answered and been perfectly pleasant, and the neighbor had gone away, and Sandra had understood in that moment, with absolute clarity, that she's going to have to do it in a way that he did not see coming, or she was not going to get out at all. She had gotten out. She had told Rosa everything. Rosa had documented it and investigated, and found nothing that rose to the level of criminal charges, because Sandra had no injuries on record, had never called police during the relationship, and Todd Garner's version of events, that the relationship had ended mutually and that Sandra was a troubled woman processing a breakup badly, was unverifiable as false and verifiable as nothing. 2 months later, Angela Forsythe was gone. Rosa had never stopped believing those two facts were connected. She had never been able to prove it. Paul thanked her and ended the call and immediately pulled everything available on Todd Garner's movements between Spokane in 2014 and Knoxville in 2017. 3 years. A gap. He filled it through employment records, tax filings, a car registration in Portland, Oregon in 2015, another in Boise, Idaho in 2016. He cross-referenced those locations and those years with missing persons databases, and felt something cold settle in his chest. When the boys' cross-reference returned a result, a woman named Theresa Van, 38 years old, disappeared in October 2016, last known address in the Bench neighborhood of Boise. Case open, no body recovered. Todd Garner had lived 6 blocks from Theresa Van's address. Paul closed his laptop and sat in the specific silence of someone who has just watched a pattern complete itself into something undeniable. 3 cities. 3 women, Spokane, Boise, Knoxville, Angela Forsythe gone, Theresa Van gone, and Carol Garner currently alive, currently inside a house on Sycamore Court with a man whose history Paul was now reading like a map of something systematic and patient and very, very careful. He called Diane Cho, told her what he had, listened to the silence on her end. That meant she was processing the same thing he had processed 20 minutes ago. "We need to get Carol Garner out of that house," Paul said. "We need probable cause to do anything that holds up," Diane said. "What do we have that's current and concrete?" Paul thought about the voice memo. 43 seconds. The recording that Ruth Pickett had made from her bedroom window at 2:17 in the morning. "The recording," he said. "And the prior pattern. And a woman in Memphis who hasn't spoken to her sister in 8 months. It's not enough for an arrest," Diane said. "I know," Paul said. "But it might be enough for something else." He drove to 412 Sycamore Court that evening and sat in Ruth Pickett's kitchen and drank the coffee she made without asking if he wanted any, and laid out what he needed from her without laying out why he needed it, because some of it was active investigation and some of it he simply did not want to say out loud to a civilian until he had no choice. He asked Ruth if she had any regular interaction with Carol Garner, any excuse to make contact that wouldn't seem unusual. Ruth looked at him over her coffee cup. "I've been bringing her things from my garden for 6 years," she said. "Tomatoes in summer, herbs when I have extra. It's never seemed unusual before." Paul nodded. "I need you to make contact tomorrow morning, after Todd leaves for work. I need you to give Carol something." He slid a card across the table. Not a business card, a plain white index card with a phone number written in pen. "Tell her to call that number from a phone that isn't hers. Tell her it's a safe line. Tell her someone is listening." Ruth looked at the card, looked at Paul. "How bad is it?" she asked quietly. Paul wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Outside, Sycamore Court was quiet the way it always was, the mature oaks, the kept lawns, the porch lights coming on as the evening deepened. "Bad enough that I drove here instead of calling," he said. Ruth picked up the card. The next morning at 9:15, Todd Garner's gray SUV pulled out of the driveway at 414 Sycamore Court and disappeared around the corner. Ruth waited 12 minutes. Then she walked next door with a small bunch of rosemary from her kitchen windowsill plant, the most natural thing in the world, the kind of thing she had done a dozen times before. Carol answered the door. Ruth held out the rosemary with one hand. With the other, turned slightly so the street couldn't see, she held out the index card. Carol looked at it, looked at Ruth. Something happened in her face that was not quite hope, and not quite terror, but lived in the narrow space between them, where people exist, when they have been surviving for a very long time. She took the rosemary. She took the card. She closed the door. Paul Reyes sat in an unmarked car 2 blocks away and waited. His phone rang at 10:47 a.m. It was Carol Garner. She spoke for 6 minutes without stopping, and what she said in those 6 minutes was enough. More than enough, finally, after everything. For the warrant that Paul had been building toward since the moment he first heard 43 seconds of a woman's voice cutting through a quiet Knoxville night. But what she said in those 6 minutes also contained something Paul had not anticipated. Something that reframed not just the present investigation, but the geography of everything he thought he understood about Todd Garner and the women who had disappeared around him. Carol Garner knew about Angela Forsythe. She had found a photograph 8 months ago, hidden in a box in the back of a closet she was not supposed to open. A photograph of a woman she didn't recognize, and on the back of it, in Todd's handwriting, a date, April 2013, and a location, not Spokane, not anywhere in Washington state, a rural address outside Knoxville, 40 minutes from Sycamore Court, land Todd had purchased under a family LLC in 2016, a year before he moved to Tennessee, that had never appeared in any search Paul had run because it was buried 3 layers deep in corporate paperwork that required a forensic accountant to find. That was why she had stopped gardening. That was why she had started checking the space behind her whenever she spoke. That was why, 8 months ago, everything had changed. She had found the photograph, and she had understood what it meant. And she had been living inside that understanding every single day since. Alone, without telling anyone, calculating whether there was any version of getting out that he would not see coming. She had been waiting for someone to knock on the right door. The warrant was signed at 6:17 p.m. on a Friday. Judge Patricia Harmon of Knox County Criminal Court read the probable cause affidavit twice and asked Paul Reyes 2 questions and signed it with the efficiency of someone who understood that time was a variable in this particular equation. The warrant covered the residence at 414 Sycamore Court and the rural property outside Knoxville registered to Garner Family Holdings LLC, 43 acres of mixed woodland, an overgrown pasture off a county road in rural Knox County that showed up on satellite imagery as nothing more than trees and a collapsed outbuilding, and a long dirt track leading in from the road and disappearing under the canopy. Carol Garner was removed from the Sycamore Court residence at 6:45 p.m. while Todd was still at work. Paul coordinated it with the precision and quietness of someone who understood that the margin for error was 0. A female officer drove Carol out through the back of the neighborhood in an unmarked car. She took nothing with her except the clothes she was wearing and a small envelope she had apparently kept hidden inside a winter coat in the back of the bedroom closet for 8 months. Prepared, waiting, the survival planning of a woman who had been thinking about this moment for a very long time. Carol was taken to a safe location. A victim advocate was with her within the hour. Todd Garner arrived home at 6:53 p.m. and found 4 police vehicles in front of his house and Paul Reyes standing on his porch. And whatever calculation ran behind his eyes in that moment, and something ran there, Paul saw it, a rapid internal adjustment, a man recalibrating. It produced the same response that Todd Garner apparently defaulted to under pressure, which was composure. Practiced, immediate, convincing composure. He was cooperative. He was pleasant. He said, of course, whatever he could do to help. He just wanted to understand what this was about. Paul told him it was about Carol. Todd expressed concern. Said he hoped she was okay. Said he loved his wife and would do anything to assist in ensuring her safety. Said it with the fluency of a man who had said versions of it before. He was placed in a police vehicle while the search of the residence was conducted. He sat in the back seat and watched through the window with an expression that Paul, glancing over twice during the next hour, could not read and did not try to. The Sycamore court search took 3 hours. What it produced was significant, but not sufficient on its own. A second phone, prepaid, found inside a hollowed-out hardcover book on the third shelf of the home office bookcase. Financial documents confirming the Garner Family Holdings LLC and the Knox County property. A locked metal box in the bedroom closet, the closet Carol had described, the one she was not supposed to open, that required a locksmith and contained, among other items, 3 photographs of women Paul didn't immediately recognize, and a folded piece of paper with a list of dates going back to 2011 that had no names attached to them and no explanation, and that made the forensic technician who unfolded it go very quiet for a moment before she bagged it. The Knox County property was a different matter. The search team arrived there at 9:40 p.m. with portable lighting and a K-9 unit, and the particular focused energy of people who believe they are about to find something and are steeling themselves for what finding it will feel like. The dirt track off the county road ran approximately 300 yards into the tree cover before opening into a clearing where the collapsed outbuilding sat, more substantial than it appeared from satellite, a barn structure that had partially fallen in on one side, but retained most of its roof on the other. The K-9 unit signaled at the edge of the clearing before they reached the building, then again 20 feet further in, then again at the far side of the structure, where the ground was uneven in a way that was not consistent with natural terrain variation, and not consistent with anything innocent. The formal excavation began the following morning at first light with a forensic archaeology team from the University of Tennessee. The university's forensic anthropology program was one of the best in the country, a fact that carried no comfort whatsoever in the context of why they were there. Ground-penetrating radar was used before any physical excavation began. The results took 4 hours to process and produced images that the lead forensic anthropologist reviewed in the mobile unit with an expression that told Paul everything before she said a word. There were 3 distinct anomalies, 3 areas of subsurface disturbance consistent with interment, 3 locations in a rough triangle around the collapsed outbuilding, spaced with a deliberateness that suggested planning rather than circumstance. The excavation would take days. The identification process would take weeks. The legal proceedings that followed would take years. Todd Garner was arrested that night on charges that would be amended and expanded multiple times over the following months as the Knox County evidence developed, and the Spokane and Boise cases were formally linked through DNA analysis and investigative cooperation that should have happened years earlier and didn't for reasons that lived in the gap between jurisdictions and databases, and the particular institutional and of cold case and read. The following month, as the filming departments, he has not confessed, he has not spoken publicly. His attorney has entered pleas of not guilty on every charge filed to date, and has characterized the physical evidence as circumstantial and the testimony of Carol Garner as the account of a woman whose mental stability is a matter his client disputes. Todd Garner sits in Knox County Detention and presents, by all accounts from corrections staff, as cooperative and calm and unremarkable, the kind of man you would not look at twice. The list of dates found in the locked metal box contained 11 entries spanning 2011 to 2022. Investigators have matched 3 of those dates to known disappearances: Angela Forsythe, Theresa Van, and a woman in Portland named Claire Hutchins who vanished in 2015 and whose case had never been connected to anything until now. 8 dates remain unmatched, 8 dates with no names, no locations, no cases yet identified that align with them. 8 women who may or may not be out there somewhere in databases that haven't yet been cross-referenced in the right way, or who may be out there in other clearings on other properties that no one has thought to look for yet. That number, 8, is the thing that keeps Paul Reyes awake, not the 3 they found. The 8 they haven't. Carol Garner is in a city she has asked not to be named publicly. She is in therapy. She is in contact with her sister Diane for the first time in 8 months. She gave a formal statement that runs to 47 pages and that prosecutors have described as the most detailed and precise victim account they have encountered in a case of this type. She is described by everyone who has worked with her as remarkably strong. People say that about survivors and mean it as a compliment, and Carol accepts it with the grace of a woman who knows that remarkable strength is sometimes just what surviving looks like from the outside. She has not spoken to Todd Garner since the evening Paul Reyes stood on the porch at 414 Sycamore Court. She does not intend to. Ruth Pickett still lives at 412 Sycamore Court. The house next door is empty now, listed for sale, no takers yet. The kind of property that carries its history visibly, even when the history isn't public knowledge, which in this case it very much is. Ruth tends her garden and brings things to neighbors and answers questions from journalists with the measured patience of a woman who has said everything she intends to say and knows the value of stopping there. She still has the voice memo on her phone, 43 seconds. She has not deleted it and does not plan to. She has never been able to fully explain why, except that it feels like the kind of thing that should be kept, the kind of thing that deserves to be remembered by someone even after the case is closed. And the news moves on and Sycamore Court goes back to being a quiet cul-de-sac where the mail carrier knows everyone's name. A woman screamed for 43 seconds in the middle of the night. One neighbor heard it and recorded it and refused to let it go. Because of that, only because of that, Carol Garner is alive. The 8 dates on that list have no such neighbor yet. No one who heard them. No one who recorded them. No one who refused to let them go. Just dates on a folded piece of paper in an evidence bag in a Knox County storage facility, waiting for someone to match them to a name, a face, a life that went quiet one day and never came back. The search continues. It may continue for a very long time.